Hello, bros. We're back with Perfume, The Story of a Murderer by Patrick Suskind. A fable of criminal genius. Remarkable, the New York Times international bestseller. Kurt Cobain's favorite book, and I really like the first two or three sections, but after that, it's become a bit of a vehicle for excess. But we're on, I think, part 13 now. Let's see what happens. 13. Bring out my candle as a page holder. 13. He worked without pause for 2 hours with increasingly hectic movements, increasingly slipshod scribblings of his pen on the paper, and increasingly large doses of perfume sprinkled onto his handkerchief and held to his nose. He could hardly smell anything now. The volatile substances he was inhaling had long since drugged him. He could no longer recognize what he thought had been established beyond doubt at the start of his analysis. He knew that it was pointless to continue smelling. He would never ascertain the ingredients of this newfangled perfume. Certainly not today, not tomorrow either, when his nose would have recovered, God willing. He had never learned fractionary smelling, dissecting scents, fragmenting a unity, whether well or not so well blended into its simple components was a wretched, loathsome business. It did not interest him. He did not want to continue. But his hand automatically kept on making the dainty motion, practiced 1,000 times over, of dunking the handkerchief, shaking it out, and whisking it rapidly past his face, and with each whisk he automatically snapped up a portion of scent-drenched air, only to let it out again with the proper exhalations and pauses, until finally his own nose, liberated him from the torture, swelling an allergic reaction till it was stopped up as tight as if plugged with wax. This is Perfume by Patrick Suskind. It was Kurt Cobain's favorite book. I am not a particular fan of Kurt Cobain or this author, but it's an interesting enough book. It's called Perfume, the story of a murder. Obviously, it's fiction, but Kurt Cobain was obsessed with this book. I'm not so obsessed with it. He could not smell a thing now, could hardly breathe. It was as if a bad cold had soldered his nose shut. Little tears gathered in the corner of his eyes. Thank God in heaven. Now he could quit in good conscience. He had done his duty to the best of his abilities, according to all the rules of the art, and was, as so often before, defeated. Ultra passe nemo obligator. Closing time. Tomorrow morning he would send off to Palisades for a large bottle of Amor and Psyche, and use it to scent the Spanish hide for Count Vermont, as per order. And after that he would take his valise full of old-fashioned soaps, scent bags, pomades, and sachets, or is it sachets, and make his rounds among the salons of doddering countesses. And one day, the last doddering countess would be dead, and with her his last customer. By then he would himself be doddering and would have to sell his business to Palisade or another one of these upstart merchants. Perhaps he would get a few thousand livres for it, and he would pack one or two bags and go off to Italy with his old wife. If she was not dead herself by then, and if he survived the trip, he would buy a little house in the country near Messina, where things were cheap. And there, in bitterest poverty, he, Giuseppe Baldini, once the greatest perfumer of Paris, would die, whenever God willed it, and that was well and good. He stopped the flagon, the flaken, flocken, floken. He stoppered the flacken, laid down his pen, and wiped the drenched handkerchief across his forehead one last time. He could sense the cooling effect of the evaporating alcohol, but nothing else. Then the sun went down. Baldini stood up. He opened the jalousie, and his body was bathed to the knees in the sunset, caught fire like a burnout torch glimmering low. He saw the deep red rim of the sun behind the Louvre and the softer fire across the slate roofs of the city. On the river, shining like gold below him, the ships had disappeared, and the wind must have come up, for gusts were serrating the surface, and it glittered now here, now there, moving ever closer, as if a giant hand were scattering millions of louis d'or over the water. For a moment it seemed the direction of the river had changed. It was flowing toward Baldini, a shimmering flood of pure gold. Baldini's eyes were moist and sad. He stood there motionless for a long time, gazing at the splendid scene. Then suddenly he flung both window casements wide and pitched the flagon with Pellicier's perfume away in a high arc. He saw it splash and rend the glittering carpet of water for an instant. Fresh air streamed into the room. Baldini gulped for breath and noticed that the swelling in his nose was subsiding. Then he closed the window. At almost the same moment, night fell very suddenly. The view of a glistening golden city and river turned into a rigid, ashen gray silhouette. Inside the room, all at once, it was dark. Baldini resumed the same position as before and stared out the window. I shall not send anyone to Palisades in the morning, he said, grasping the back of his armchair with both hands. I shall not do it, and I shall not make my tour of the salons either. Instead, I shall go to the notary tomorrow morning and sell my house and my business. This is what I shall do. E basta! The expression on his face was that of a cheeky young boy, and he suddenly felt very happy. He was once again the young Baldini, as bold and determined as ever to contend with fate, even if contending meant a retreat in this case. And what if it did? There was nothing else to do. These were stupid times, and they left him no choice. God gives good times and bad times, but he does not wish us to bemoan and bewail the bad times, but to prove ourselves men. And he had given his sign. That golden blood-red mirage of the city had been a warning. Act now, Baldini, before it is too late. Your house still stands firm. Your storage rooms are still full. You will still be able to get a good price for your slumping business. The decisions are still in your hands. To grow old living modestly in Messina had not been his goal in life. True, but it was more honorable and pleasing to God. Hello, Freddie. Than to perish in splendor in Paris. Let the Bruets, Cultius, and Palisades have their triumph. Giuseppe Baldini was clearing out, but he did it unbent and of his own free will. He was quite proud of himself now, and his mind was finally at peace. For the first time in years, there was an easing in his back of the subordinate's cramp that had tensed his neck and given an increasingly obsequious hunch to his shoulders. And he stood up straight without strain, relaxed and free and pleased with himself. His breath passed lightly through his nose. He could clearly smell the scent of amour and psyche that reigned in the room, but he did not let it affect him any more. Baldini had changed his life and felt wonderful. He would go up to his wife now and inform her of his decision, and then he would make a pilgrimage to Notre Dame and light a candle, thanking God for his gracious prompting and for having endowed him. Giuseppe Baldini, with such unbelievable strength of character, not character, with almost youthful elan, he plopped his wig onto his bald head, slipped into his blue coat, grabbed the candlestick from the deck, and left his study. He had just lit the tallow candle in the stairwell to light his way up to his living quarters when he heard a doorbell ring on the ground floor. It was not the Persian chimes at the shop door, but the shrill ring of the servant's entrance, a repulsive sound that had always annoyed him. He had often made up his mind to have the thing removed and replaced with a more pleasant bell, but then the cost would always seem excessive. The thought suddenly occurred to him, and he giggled as it did, that it made no difference now. He would be selling the obtrusive doorbell along with the house. Let his successor deal with the vexation. The bell rang shrilly again. He cocked his ear for sounds below. Apparently, Chenet had left, had already left the shop, and the servant girl seemed not about to answer it either. So Baldini went downstairs to open the door himself. He pulled back the bolt, swung the heavy door open, and saw nothing. The darkness completely swallowed the light of his candle. Then, very gradually, he began to make out a figure. A child or a half-grown boy carrying something over his arm. What do you want? I'm from Maitre Grimaud. I'm delivering the goatskins, said the figure, and stepped closer and held out to him a stack of hides. Hanging from his cocked arm, by the light of his candle, Baldini could now see the boy's face and his nervous, searching eyes. He carried himself hunched over. He looked as if he were hiding behind his own outstretched arm, waiting to be struck a blow. It was Grenouille. It was Grenouille. All right, part 14. The goatskins for the Spanish leather. Baldini remembered now. He had ordered the hides from Grimaud a few days before, the finest, softest goatskin to be used as a blotter for Count Vermont's desk. 15 francs apiece, but he really did not need them anymore and could spare the expense. On the other hand, if he were simply to send the boy back, who knew? It could make a bad impression. People might begin to talk. Rumors might start. Baldini is getting undependable. Baldini isn't getting any orders. Baldini can't pay his bills. And that would not be good. No, because something like that was likely to lower the selling price of his business. It would be better to accept these useless goatskins. No one needed to know ahead of time that Giuseppe Baldini had changed his life. Come in. He let the boy inside, and they walked across to the shop, Baldini leading with the candle, Grenouille behind him with the hides. It was the first time Grenouille had ever been in a perfumery, a place in which odors are not accessories but stand unabashedly at the center of interest. Naturally, he knew every single perfumery and apothecary in the city, had stood for nights on end at their shop windows, his nose pressed to the cracks of their doors. He knew every single odor handled here, and had often merged them in his innermost thoughts to create the most splendid perfumes. So there was nothing new awaiting him, and yet, just as a musically gifted child burns to see an orchestra up close or to climb into the church choir where the organ keyboard lies hidden, Grenouille burned to see a perfumery from the inside. And when he had heard that leather was to be delivered to Baldini, he had done all he could to make sure that he would be the one to deliver it. And here he stood in Baldini's shop, on the one spot in Paris with the greatest number of professional scents assembled in one small space. He could not see much in the fleeting light of the candle, only brief glimpses of the shadows thrown by the counter with its scales, the two herons above the vessel, an armchair for the customers, the dark cupboards along the walls, the brief flash of bronze utensils and white labels on bottles and crucibles. Nor could he smell anything beyond what he could already smell from the street. But he at once felt the seriousness that reigned in these rooms. You might almost call it a holy seriousness, if the word holy had held any meaning whatever for Grenouille, for he could feel the cold seriousness, the craftsman-like sobriety, the staid business sense that adhered to every piece of furniture, every utensil, to tubs, bottles, and pots. And as he walked behind Baldini in Baldini's shadow, for Baldini did not take the trouble to light his way, He was overcome by the idea that he belonged here and nowhere else, that he would stay here, that from here he would shake the world from its foundations. The idea, of course, the idea was, of course, one of perfectly grotesque immodesty. Nothing, absolutely nothing, that could justify a stray tanner's helper of dubious origin, without connections or protection, without the least social standing, to hope that he would get so much as a toehold in the most renowned perfume shop in Paris. All the less so since we know that the decision had been made to dissolve the business. But what had formed in Grenouille's immodest thoughts was not, after all, a matter of hope, but of certainty. He knew that the only reason he would leave this shop would be to fetch his clothes from Grimal's, and then never again. The tick had scented blood. It had been dormant for years, encapsulated, and had waited. Now it let itself drop, for better or for worse, entirely without hope, and that was why he was so certain. They had crossed through the shop. Baldini opened the back room that faced the river and served partly as a storeroom, partly as a workshop and laboratory where soaps were cooked, pomades stirred, and toilet waters blended in big bellied bottles. There, he said, pointing to a large table in front of the window. Lay them there. Granuglia stepped out from Baldini's shadow, laid the leather on the table, but quickly jumped back again, placing himself between Baldini and the door. Baldini stood there for a while. He held the candle to one side to prevent the wax from dripping on the table, and stroked the smooth surface of the skins with the back of his fingers. Then he pulled back the top one and ran his hand across the velvety reverse side, rough and yet soft at the same time. They were very good goatskins, just made for Spanish leather. As they dried, they would hardly shrink, and when correctly pared, they would become supple again. He could feel that at once just by pressing one between his thumb and index finger. They could be impregnated with scent for 5 to 10 years. They were very, very good hides. Perhaps he could make gloves from them, 3 pairs for himself and 3 for his wife for the trip to Messina. He pulled back his hand. He was touched by the way this work table looked. Everything lay ready. The glass basin for the perfume bath, the glass plate for drying, the mortars for the tincture, pestle and spatula, brush and parer, and shears. It was as if these things were only sleeping because it was dark and would come to life in the morning. Should he perhaps take the table with him to Messina? And a few of the tools, only the most important ones. You could sit and work very nicely at this table. The boards were oak and legs as well, and it was cross braced so that nothing about it could wiggle or wobble. Acids couldn't mar it, or oils or slips of a knife, but it would cost a fortune to take it with him to Messina, even by ship. And therefore it would be sold. The table would be sold tomorrow, and everything that lay on it, under it, and beside it would be sold as well, because he, Baldini, might have a sentimental heart, but he also had strength of character, and so he would follow through on his decision, as difficult as that was to do. He would give it all up with tears in his eyes, but he would do it none the less because he knew he was right. He had been given a sign. He turned to go. There at the door stood this little deformed person he had almost forgotten about. They're fine, Baldini said. Tell your master that the skins are fine. I'll come by in the next few days and pay for them. Yes, sir, said Granuglia, but stood where he was, blocking the way for Baldini, who was ready to leave the workshop. Baldini was somewhat startled, but so unsuspecting that he took the boy's behavior not for insolence, but for shyness. What is it? He asked. Is there something else I can do for you? Well, speak up. What's this? Why did that pop up? Granuglia stood there cowering and gazing at Baldini with a look of apparent timidity, but which in reality came from a cunning intensity. I want to work for you, maitre, it's a maitre d, so maitre Baldini, work for you here in your business. It was not spoken as a request, but as a demand. Nor was it really spoken, but squeezed out, hissed out, in reptile fashion, and once again Baldini misread Granuia's outrageous self-confidence as boyish awkwardness. He gave him a friendly smile. "You're a tanner's apprentice, my lad," he said. "I have no use for a tanner's apprentice. I have a journeyman already, and I don't need an apprentice. You want to make these goat skins smell good, Maitre Baldini. You want to make this leather I've brought you smell good, don't you?" Granuia hissed, as if he had paid not the least attention to Baldini's answer. "Yes, indeed," said Baldini. "With armor and psyche by Pelisse?" Granuia asked, cowering even more than before. At that, a wave of mild terror swept through Baldini's body, not because he asked himself how this lad knew all about it so exactly, but simply because the boy had said the name of the wretched perfume that had defeated his efforts as at decoding today. "How did you ever get the absurd idea that I would use someone else's perfume to... You reek of it," Granuia hissed. "You have it on your forehead, and in your right coat pocket is a handkerchief soaked with it. It's not very good, this Amor and Psyche. It's bad. There's too much bergamot and too much rosemary, and not enough attar of roses." "Ah!" Baldini said, totally surprised that the conversation had veered from the general to the specific. "What else?" "Orange blossom, lime, clove, musk, jasmine, alcohol, and something that I don't know the name of. There, you see, right there, in that bottle." And he pointed a finger into the darkness. Baldini held the candlestick up in that direction, his gaze following the boy's index finger toward a cupboard, and falling upon a bottle filled with a grayish yellow balm. "Storax?" he asked. Granuia nodded. "Yes, that's in it too, Storax." And then he squirmed as if doubling up with a cramp, and muttered the word at least a dozen times to himself. "Storax, Storax, 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 Storax." Baldini held his candle up to this lump of humankind wheezing Storax, and thought, either he is possessed, or a thieving impostor, or truly gifted, for it was perfectly possible that the list of ingredients, if mixed in the right proportions, could result in the perfume Amor and Psyche. It was in fact probable. Attar of roses, clove, and storax. It was those three ingredients that he had searched for so desperately this afternoon, joining them with the other parts of the composition, which he believed he had recognized as well, would unite the segments into a pretty rounded pastry. It was now only a question of the exact proportions in which you had to join them. To find that out, he, Baldini, would have to run experiments for several days, a horrible task, almost worse than the basic identification of the parts, for it meant you had to measure and weigh and record, and all the while pay damn close attention, because the least bit of inattention, a tremble of the pipette, a mistake in counting drops, could ruin the whole thing, and every botched attempt was dreadfully expensive. Every ruined mixture was worth a small fortune. He wanted to test this mannequin, wanted to ask him about the exact formula for Amor and Psyche. If he knew it to the drop and dram, then he was obviously an impostor who had somehow pinched the recipe from Pelisse in order to gain access and get a position with him, Baldini. But if he came close, then he was a genius of scent, and as such provoked Baldini's professional interest. Not that Baldini would jeopardize his firm to give up his business. This perfume by Pelisse was itself not the important thing to him. Even if the fellow could deliver it to him by the gallon, Baldini would not dream of scenting Count Vermont, Spanish hides with it. But he had not been a perfumer his life long, had not concerned himself his life long with the blending of scents, to have lost all professional passions from one moment to the next. Right now he was interested in finding out the formula for this damned perfume, and beyond that, in studying the gifts of this mysterious boy who had parsed the scent right off his forehead. He wanted to know what was behind that. He was quite simply curious. "You have, it appears, a fine nose, young man," he said, once Granuia had ceased his wheezings, and he stepped back into the workshop, carefully setting the candlestick on the work table. "Without doubt, a fine nose, but I have the best nose in Paris, Matra, Baldini, Granuglia interrupted with a rasp. I know all the odors in the world, all of them. Only I don't know the names of some of them, but I can learn the names. The odors that have names, there aren't many of those. There are only a few thousand. I'll learn them all. I'll never forget the name of that balm, Storax. The balm is called Storax. It's called Storax. Silence! Shouted Baldini. Do not interrupt me when I'm speaking. You are impertinent and insolent. No one knows 1,000 odors by name. Even if I don't know 1,000 of them by name, at best a few hundred, for there aren't more than a few hundred in our business. All the rest aren't odors, they are simply stenches. During the rather lengthy interruption that he had burst from him, Granuglia had almost unfolded his body, had in fact been so excited for the moment that he had nailed both arms in circles, to suggest the all of them that he knew. But at Baldini's reply he collapsed back into himself, like a black toad lurking there motionless on the threshold. I have, of course, been aware, Baldini continued, for some time now that Amor and Psyche consisted of storax, attar of roses and cloves, plus bergamot and extract of rosemary, etc. All that is needed to find out is, and I said, as I said, a passably fine nose, and it may well be that God has given you a passably fine nose, as he has many, many other people as well, particularly at your age. A perfumer, however, and here Baldini raised his index finger and puffed out his chest. A perfumer, however, needs more than a passably fine nose. He needs an incorruptible, hard-working organ that has been trained to smell for many decades, enabling him to decipher even the most complicated odors by composition and proportion, as well as to create new unknown mixtures of scent. Such a nose, and here he tapped his with his finger. It is not something one has, young man. It is something one acquires by perseverance and diligence. Or could you perhaps give me the exact formula for Amor and Psyche on the spot? Well, could you? Granuglia did not answer. Could you perhaps give me a rough guess? Baldini said, bending forward a bit to get a better look at the toad at his door. Just a rough one. An estimation. Well, speak up. Best nose in Paris. But Granuglia was silent. You see, said Baldini, equally both satisfied and disappointed. And he straightened up. You can't do it. Of course you can't. You're one of those people who know whether there is chervil or parsley in the soup at mealtime. That's fine. There's something to be said for that. But that doesn't make you a cook. No, not by a long shot. Whatever the art or whatever the craft, and make a note of this before you go, talent means next to nothing, while experience acquired in humility and with hard work means everything. He was reaching for the candlestick on the table when from the doorway came Granuglia's pinched snarl. I don't know what a formula is, Matri. I don't know that, but otherwise I know everything. A formula is the alpha and omega of every perfume, replied Baldini sternly. For he wanted to end this conversation now. It contained scrupulously exact instructions for the proportions needed to mix individual ingredients so that the result is the unmistakable scent one desires. That is a formula. It is the recipe. If that is a word you understand better. Formula, rasped Granuglia, and grew somewhat larger in the doorway. I don't need a formula. I have the recipe in my nose. Can I mix it for you, Matron? Can I mix it? Can I? How's that? Cried Baldini in a rather loud voice and held the candle up to the gnome's face. How would you mix it? For the first time, Granuglia did not flinch. Why, they're all here. All the ones you need, the scents, they're all here in this room, he said, pointing again into the darkness. There's attar of roses, there's orange blossom, that's clove, that's rosemary. There, certainly they're here, roared Baldini. They are all here, but I'm telling you, you blockhead, that is of no use if one does not have the formula. There's jasmine, alcohol there, bergamot there, storax there, Granuglia went on crowing, and at each name he pointed to a different spot in the room, although it was so dark that at best you could surmise the shadows of the cupboards filled with bottles. You can see in the dark, Kenya, Baldini went on. You not only have the best nose, but also the keenest eyes in Paris, do you? Now, if you have passably good ears, then open them up, because I'm telling you, you are a little swindler. You probably picked up your information at Palisades, did some spying. Is that it? And now you think you can pull the wool over my eyes, right? Granouille was now standing up, completely unfolded to full size, so to speak, in the doorway, his legs slightly apart, his arms slightly spread, so that he looked like a black spider that had latched on to the threshold and frame. Give me 10 minutes, he said, in close to a normal, fluent pattern of speech, and I will produce for you the perfume, amour, and psyche. Right now, right here in this room, Maitre, give me just 5 minutes. Do you suppose I'd let you slop around here in my laboratory with essences that are worth a fortune? You? Yes, said Granouille. Bah! Baldini shouted, exhaling all at once every bit of air he had in him. Then he took a deep breath and a long look at Granouille, the spider, had thought it over. Basically, it makes no difference, he thought, because it will all be over tomorrow anyway. I know for a fact that he can't do what he claims he can't possibly do it. Why, that would make him greater than the great Frangipani. But why shouldn't I let him demonstrate before my eyes what I know to be true? It is possible that someday in Messina people do grow very strange in old age and their minds fix on the craziest ideas. I'll get the notion that I had failed to recognize an olfactory genius, a creature upon whom the grace of God had been poured out in superabundance, a wonderkind. It's totally out of the question. Everything my reason tells me says it is out of the question. But miracles do happen, that is certain. So what if, when I lie dying in Messina some day, the thought comes to me there on my deathbed, on that evening back in Paris, I shut my eyes to a miracle? That would not be very pleasant, Baldini. Let the fool waste a few drops of attar of roses and musk tincture. You would have wasted them yourself if Palisades perfume had still interested you. And what are a few drops, though expensive ones, very, very expensive compared to certain knowledge and a peaceful old age? Now pay attention, he said with an affectedly stern voice. Pay attention, What is your name, anyway? Granouille, said Granouille. Jean Baptiste Granouille. Aha, said Baldini. All right then. Now pay attention, Jean Baptiste Granouille. I've thought it over. You shall have the opportunity now, this very moment, to prove your assertion. Your grandiose failure will also be an opportunity for you to learn the virtue of humility, which, although one may pardon the total lack of its development at your tender age, will be an absolute prerequisite for later advancement as a member of your guild and for your standing as a man of honor, a dutiful subject, and a good Christian. I am prepared to teach you this lesson at my own expense. For certain reasons, I am feeling generous this evening, and who knows? Perhaps the recollection of this scene will amuse me one day, but do not suppose that you can dupe me. Giuseppe Baldini's nose is old, but it is still sharp enough immediately to recognize the slightest difference between your mixture and this product here. And at that he pulled the handkerchief drenched in amour and psyche from his pocket and waved it under Granouille's nose. Come closer, best nose in Paris. Come here to the table and show me what you can do. But be careful not to drop anything or knock anything over. Don't touch anything yet. Let me provide some light first. We want to have lots of illumination for this little experiment, don't we? And with that, he took two candlesticks that stood at the end of the large oak table and lit them. He placed all three next to one another along the back, pushed the goat skins to one side, cleared the middle of the table, then with a few composed yet rapid motions, he fetched from a small stand the utensils needed for the task. The big-bellied mixing bottle, the glass funnel, the pipette, the small and large measuring glasses, and placed them in proper order on the oaken surface. Granouille had meanwhile freed himself from the door frame. Even while Baldini was making his pompous speech, the stiffness and cunning intensity had fallen away from him. He had heard only the approval, only the yes, with the inner jubilation of a child that has sulked its way to some permission granted. and thumbs its nose at the limitations, conditions, and moral admonitions tied to it. Standing there at his ease and letting the rest of Baldini's oration flow by, he was for the first time more human than animal, because he knew that he had already conquered the man who had yielded to him. While Baldini was still fusing with his candlesticks at the table, Granouilla had already slipped off into the darkness of the laboratory with its cupboards full of precious essences, oils, and tinctures, and following his sure scenting nose, grabbed each of the necessary bottles from the shelves. There were 9 altogether: essence of orange blossom, lime oil, attars of rose and clove, extracts of jasmine, bergamot, and rosemary, musk tincture, and storix balm, all quickly plucked down and set at the ready on the edge of the table. The last item he lugged over was a demijohn full of high-proof, rectified spirit. Then he placed himself behind Baldini, who was still arranging his mixing utensils with deliberate pedantry, moving this glass back a bit, that one over more to one side, so that everything would be in old its old accustomed order and displayed to its best advantage in the candlelight, and waited, quivering with impatience, for the old man to get out of the way and make room for him. There, Baldini said at last, stepping aside, I've lined up everything you'll require for, let us graciously call it, your experiment. Don't break anything, don't spill anything, just remember, the liquids you are about to dabble with for the next 5 minutes are so precious and so rare that you will never again in all your life hold them in your hands in such concentrated form. How much of it shall I make for you, Maitre? Granouilla asked. Make what? Said Baldini, who had not yet finished his speech. How much of the perfume? Rasped Granouilla. How much of it do you want? Shall I fill this big bottle here to the rim? And he pointed to a mixing bottle that held a gallon at the very least. No, you shall not, screamed Baldini in horror, a scream of both spontaneous fear and a deeply rooted dread of wasted property. Embarrassed at what his scream had revealed, he followed it up by roaring, and don't interrupt me when I'm speaking, either. Then, in a calm voice tinged with irony, he continued, Why would we need a gallon of a perfume that neither of us thinks much of? Half a beakerful will do, really, but since such small quantities are difficult to measure, I'll allow you to start with a third of a mixing bottle. Good, said Granouilla. I'm going to fill a third of this bottle with Amore and Psyche. But, Maitre Baldini, I will do it in my own way. I don't know if it will be how a craftsman would do it. I don't know how that's done, but I will do it my own way. As you please, said Baldini, who knew that in this business there was no your way or my way, but one and only one way, which consisted of knowing the formula and using the appropriate calculations for the quantity one desired, creating a precisely measured concentrate of the various essences, which then had to be volatilized into a true perfume by mixing it in a precise ratio with alcohol, usually varying between 1 to 10 and 1 to 20. There was no other way that he knew. And therefore, what he was now called upon to witness, first with derisive hauteur, then with dismay, and finally with helpless astonishment, seemed to him nothing less than a miracle. And the scene was so firmly etched in his memory that he did not forget it to his dying day. Shall we continue? What are we at? 39 minutes? No, that's a rather long chapter coming up. Looks like 7 more pages. 86. That's only 6 pages. 15. The little man named Granouilla first uncorked the demijohn of alcohol, heaving the heavy vessel up gave him difficulty. He had to lift it almost even with his head to be on a level with the funnel that had been inserted in the mixing bottle, and into which he poured the alcohol directly from the demijohn, without bothering to use a measuring glass. Baldini shuddered at such concentrated ineptitude. Not only had the fellow turned the world of perfumery upside down by starting with the solvent without having first created the concentrate to be dissolved, but he was also hardly even physically capable of the task. He was shaking with exertion, and Baldini was waiting at any moment for the heavy demijohn to come crashing down and smash everything on the table to pieces. The candles, he thought, for God's sake, the candles! They're going to be an explosion. He'll burn my house down, and he was about to lunge for the demijohn and grab it out of the madman's hands when Granouilla set it down himself, getting it back on the floor all in one piece, and stoppered it. A clear, light liquid swayed in the bottle, not a drop spilled. For a few moments Granouilla panted for breath, but with a look of contentment on his face, as if the hardest part of the job were behind him, and indeed what happened now proceeded with such speed that Baldini could hardly follow it with his eyes, let alone keep track of the order in which it occurred, or make even partial sense of the procedure. Granouilla grabbed apparently at random from the row of essences in their flacons, pulled out the glass stoppers, held the contents under his nose for an instant, splashed a bit of one bottle, dribbled a drop or two of another, poured a dash of a third into the funnel, and so on. Pipette, test tube, measuring glass, spoons, and rods, all the utensils that allow the perfumer to control the complicated process of mixing. Granouilla did not so much as touch a single one of them. It was as if he were just playing, splashing and swishing like a child busy cooking up some ghastly brew of water, grass, and mud, which he then asserts to be soup. Yes, like a child, thought Baldini. All at once, he looks like a child despite his ungainly hands, despite his scarred, pockmarked face and his bulbous old man's nose. I took him to be older than he is, but now he seems much younger to me. He looks as if he were 3 or 4. Looks just like one of those unapproachable, incomprehensible, willful little pre-human creatures who, in their ostensible innocence, think only of themselves, who want to subordinate the whole world to their despotic will, and would do it too if one let them pursue their Jesus Christ, megalomaniacal ways, and did not apply the strictest pedagogical principles to guide them to a disciplined, self-controlled, fully human existence. There was just such a fanatical child trapped inside this young man, standing at the table with eyes aglow, having forgotten everything around him, apparently no longer aware that there was anything else in the laboratory but himself and these bottles that he tipped into the funnel with nimble awkwardness to mix up an insane brew that he would confidently swear and would truly believe to be the exquisite perfume Amor and Psyche. Baldini shuddered as he watched the fellow bustling about in the candlelight, so shockingly absurd and so shockingly self-confident. In the old days, so he thought, and for a moment he felt as sad and miserable and furious as he had that afternoon while gazing out onto the city, glowing ruddy in the twilight. In the old days, people like that simply did not exist. He was an entirely new specimen of the race, one that could arise only in exhausted, dissipated times like these. But he was about to be taught his lesson, the impertinent boy. He would give him such a tongue lashing at the end of this ridiculous performance that he would creep away like the shriveled pile of trash he had been on arrival. Vermin. One dared not get involved with anyone at all these days. The world was simply reaming or teeming with absurd vermin. Baldini was so busy with his personal exasperation and disgust at the age that he did not really comprehend what it was intended when Granouilla suddenly stoppered up all the flacons, pulled the funnel out of the mixing bottle, grabbed the neck of the bottle with his right hand, capped it with the palm of his left, and shook it vigorously. Only when the bottle had been spun through the air several times and its precious contents sloshing back and forth like lemonade between belly and neck, did Baldini let loose a shout of rage and horror. "Stop it!" he screeched. "That's enough. Stop at this moment. Basta! Put that bottle back on the table and don't touch anything else. Do you understand? Nothing else. I must have been crazy to listen to your asinine gibberish. The way you handle these things, your crudity, your primitive lack of judgment, demonstrate to me that you are a bungler, a barbaric bungler, and a beastly, cheeky, snot-nosed brat besides. You wouldn't make a good lemonade mixer, not even a good licorice water vendor, let alone a perfumer. Just be glad, be grateful, and content that your master lets you slop around in tanning fluids. Do not dare it ever again, do you hear me? Do not dare ever again to set a foot across the threshold of a perfumer's shop. Thus spoke Baldini, and even as he spoke, the air around him was saturated with the odor of Amor and Psyche. Odors have a power of persuasion stronger than that of words, appearances, emotions, or will. The persuasive power of an odor cannot be fended off. It enters into us like breath into our lungs. It fills us up, imbues us totally. There is no remedy for it. Granua had set down the bottle, removing his perfume moistened hand from its neck and wiping it on his shirt tail. One, two steps back, and the clumsy way he hunched his body together under Baldini's tirade sent enough waves rolling out into the room to spread the newly created scent in all directions. Nothing more was needed. True, Baldini ranted on and railed and cursed, but with every breath his outward show of rage found less and less inner nourishment. He sensed he had been proved wrong, which was why his peroration could only soar to empty pathos. And when he fell silent, had been silent for a good while, he had no need of Granuia's remark. It's all done. He knew that already. But nevertheless, although in the meantime air heavy with Amor and Psyche was undulating all about him, he stepped up to the old oak table to make his test. He pulled a fresh snowy white lace handkerchief from his coat pocket, the left one, unfolded it, and sprinkled it with a few drops that he extracted from the mixing bottle with the long pipette. He waved the handkerchief with outstretched arm to aerate it, and then pulled it past his nose with the delicate, well practiced motion, soaking up its scent. Letting it out again in little puffs, he sat down on a stool, where before his face had been bright red with erupting anger. All at once he had grown pale. Incredible, he murmured softly to himself. By God, incredible. And he pressed the handkerchief to his nose again, and sniffed and shook his head and muttered, incredible. It was Amor and Psyche. Beyond the shadow of a doubt, Amor and Psyche, that despicable, ingenious blend of scents, so exactly copied that not even Pelisset himself would have been able to distinguish it from his own product. Incredible. Small and ashen, the great Baldini sat on his stool, looking ridiculous with handkerchief in hand, pressing it to his nose, like an old maid with the sniffles. By now he was totally speechless. He didn't even say incredible anymore, but nodding gently and staring at the contents of the mixing bottle, could only let out a monotone hmm, 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 hmm. After a while, Granua approached, stepping up to the table soundlessly as a shadow. It's not a good perfume, he said. It's been put together very bad, this perfume has. Hmm, hmm, said Baldinia, and Granua continued, if you'll let me, Mater, I'll make it better. Give me a minute, and I'll make a proper perfume out of it. Hmm, said Baldini, and nodded, not in consent, but because he was in such a helplessly apathetic condition that he would have said, hmm, and nodded to anything. And he went on nodding and murmuring, and made no effort to interfere as Granua began to mix away a second time, pouring the alcohol from the demijohn into the mixing bottle a second time, right on top of the perfume already in it, tipping the contents of flakons a second time in apparently random order and quantity into the funnel. Only at the end of the procedure, Granua did not shake the bottle this time, but swirled it about gently like a brandy glass, perhaps in deference to Baldini's delicacy, perhaps because the contents seemed more precious to him this time. Only then, as the liquid whirled about in the bottle, did Baldini awaken from his numb state and stand up, the handkerchief still pressed to his nose. Of course, as if he were arming himself against yet another attack upon his most private self. It's all done, Mater. Granua said. Now it's a really good scent. Yes, yes, fine, fine, Baldini replied and waved him off with his free hand. Don't you want to test it? Granua gurgled on. Don't you want to, Mater? Aren't you going to test it? Later. I'm not in the mood to test it at the moment. Have other things on my mind. Go now. Come on. And he picked up one of the candlesticks and passed through the door into the shop. Granua followed him. They entered the narrow hallway that led to the servants' entrance. The old man shuffled up to the doorway, pulled back the bolt, and opened the door. He stepped aside to let the lad out. Can't I come to work for you, Maitre, can't I? Granua asked, standing on the threshold, hunched over again, the lurking look returning to his eyes. I don't know, said Baldini. I shall think about it. Go. And then Granua had vanished, gone in a split second, swallowed up by the darkness. Baldini stood there and stared into the night. In his right hand he held the candlestick, in his left the handkerchief. Like someone with a nosebleed, but in fact he was simply frightened. He quickly bolted the door, then he took the protective handkerchief from his face, shoved it into his pocket, and walked back through the shop to his laboratory. The scent was so heavenly fine that tears welled into Baldini's eyes. He did not have to test it. He simply stood at the table in front of the mixing bottle and breathed. The perfume was glorious. It was to Amor Psyche as a symphony is to the scratching of a lonely violin. And it was more. Baldini closed his eyes and watched as the most sublime memories were awakened within him. He saw himself as a young man walking through the evening gardens of Naples. He saw himself lying in the arms of a woman with dark curly hair and saw the silhouette of a bouquet of roses on the windowsill. As the night wind passed by, he heard the random song of birds and the distant music from a harbor tavern. He heard whisperings at his ear. He heard I love you and felt his hair ruffle with bliss. Now at this very moment. He forced open his eyes and groaned with pleasure. This perfume was not like any perfume known before. It was not a scent that made things smell better, not some sachet or sachet, some toiletry. It was completely, it was something completely new, capable of creating a whole world, a magical, rich world. And in an instant, you forgot all the loathsomeness around you and felt so rich, so at ease, so free, so fine. The hairs that had ruffled up on Baldini's arm fell back again, and a befuddling peace took possession of his soul. He picked up the goat leather lying at the table's edge, and a knife, and trimmed away. Then he laid the pieces in the glass basin and poured the new perfume over them. He fixed a pane of glass over the basin, divided the rest of the perfume between two small bottles, applied labels to them, and wrote the words Nuit Napolitain on them. Then he extinguished the candles and left. Once upstairs, he said nothing to his wife while they ate. Above all, he said nothing about the solemn decision he had arrived at that afternoon, and his wife said nothing either, for she noticed that he was in good spirits, and that was enough for her. Nor did he walk over to Notre Dame to thank God for his strength of character. Indeed, that night he forgot, for the first time ever, to say his evening prayers. Now that was a good chapter, or whatever this is. I don't know if these are chapters or vignettes or what they are, but that was a good one. And I will read 2 more pages because why not? We're already at 54. The next morning he went straight to Grimaud. First he paid for his goat leather, paid in full without a grumble or the least bit of haggling, and then he invited Grimaud to the Tour d'Argent for a bottle of white wine and negotiations concerning the purchase of Granua, his apprentice. It goes without saying that he did not reveal to him the whys and wherefores of this purchase. He told some story about how he had a large order for scented leather, and to fill it, he needed unskilled help. He required a lad of few needs who would do simple tasks, cutting leather and so forth. He ordered another bottle of wine and offered 20 livres as recompense for the inconvenience the loss of Granua would cause Grimaud. 20 livres was an enormous sum. Grimaud immediately took him up on it. They walked to the tannery, where, strangely enough, Granua was waiting with his bundle already packed. Baldini paid the 20 livres and took him along at once, well aware that he had just made the best deal of his life. Grimaud, who for his part was convinced that he had just made the best deal of his life, returned to the Tour d'Argent. There drank 2 more bottles of wine, moved over to the Lion d'Or on the other bank around noon, and got so rip-roaring drunk there that when he decided to go back to the Tour de Jean late that night, he got the Rue Geoffroy Lanier confused with the Rue de Nonainderes, and instead of coming out directly onto the Pont Marie as he had intended, he was brought by ill fortune to the Quai des Ormes, where he splashed lengthwise and face first into the water like a soft mattress. He was dead in an instant. He'd done. The river, however, needed considerable time to drag him out from the shallows, past the barges moored there into the stronger main current, and not until the early morning hours did Grimaud the tanner, or better, his soaked carcass, float briskly downriver toward the west. As he passed the Pont Argent, soundlessly, without bumping against the bridge piers, 60 feet directly overhead, Jean-Baptiste Grenouille was going to bed. A bunk had been set up for him in a back corner of Baldini's laboratory, and he was now about to take possession of it, while his former employee floated down the cold Seine. All 4 limbs extended. Grenouille rolled himself up into a little ball like a tick, and he fell off to sleep. He sank deeper and deeper into himself, leading the triumphant entry into his innermost fortress, where he dreamed of an odoriferous victory banquet, a gigantic orgy with clouds of incense and fogs of myrrh, held in his own honor. And that will be all for now. Page 88. 57 minutes and 22 seconds. Blah, blah, blah. That's all, bros. That's all.